which of those jobs was the easiest or the most fun. And he did a marvelous job of comparing and contrasting the cultures as I knew it, but he concluded, he said, the best job is the Pentagon because you've got so many really good lieutenant colonels and majors running around that building. If you listen to them, they'll make you look very good. And of course, being a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force, even though I was in Soviet, that made me feel very good, having already served in the Pentagon. And so it's a real privilege to have Doug Wilson, as you know from Linda's introduction, the Assistant Secretary of Defense. One of the things that she left out, Doug started his life as an FSO, which prepared him very well in his understanding for multiple roles. And also what she left out was, well, we recruited him before President Obama did. Doug was on the board with us, the U.S. Center for Citizen Diplomacy, and he and Aaron Williams were both plucked from our board and called to duty by the President, and as you see, they're doing magnificent things. So Doug, let me turn the panel over to you, and thank you very much for you and the panel for spending time with us today.
David, thank you very much. I have no idea how to use these microphones. I'm hoping that somebody in the back is either turning them off or you'll let me know if you can't hear us. But I'm delighted to be here today, and I'm very delighted that 4 friends and colleagues have agreed to join to talk about this session is called the military, citizen diplomacy and the role of the military. It really should be called how the cultures and societies of our allies and our adversaries shape their views that we, not only as American citizens or as citizen diplomats, but our men and women in uniform need to understand as they are approaching the world. I'd like to just briefly introduce my colleagues because a couple are different from what is in your booklet. John Kirby, who is Chairman Mullen's chief communicator, had to travel with Chairman Mullen today to Boston, was unable to come. David Sedney, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Afghanistan, Pakistan, is now testifying on the Hill. But we are extremely lucky to have Caitlin Hayden and Brian Cullen in their place. And let me just go down and introduce you first to Caitlin Hayden, who serves as the press officer and spokesperson at the United States Embassy in Kabul, and one of the finest foreign service officers I've met, and really kind of the linchpin in dealing not just with the press, but in dealing with the non-military leaders in society in Afghanistan. Next to Caitlin is Chris Kolenda. Colonel Chris Kolenda. In the book it tells you he's the former commander of the 191 Cavalry, 173rd Airborne Brigade, and former military special advisor to the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. What Chris Kolenda is probably the most knowledgeable young military officer on the integration of the military and non-military aspects of counterinsurgency that I have met. He's the co-author of Leadership, the Warrior's Art, and in a minute we're going to also explore with him why it was that he is the only member of the military to be mentioned by author Greg Mortensen in his books, and the only member of the military with whom Greg worked in order to build a school in Afghanistan. Brian Cullen is my professional colleague at the Department of Defense. He is now the Director of Communication, Planning, and Integration in my office. With that is a long way of saying he is at the nexus of policy, public affairs, strategic communication, and the military commands. Brian brings to this position an amazing wealth of experience, which includes serving as a former spokesman at the 6th Fleet in Naples, a former Deputy White House press secretary handling foreign affairs, and former fellow at the Brookings Institution. Next to him, you will recognize from television and from our just concluded panel, my good friend Barbara Starr, who is Pentagon correspondent on national security, an Emmy-winning producer, and she won't say this, but I will, one of the most knowledgeable and serious reporters on national security that I've ever dealt with, despite the fact that I have to hide so many times because I can't engage on all the questions that she asks me. But one of the top press representatives at the Pentagon and in national security. And I'd like to just start this this panel by saying that I think people don't often understand the degree to which culture and society now affect the roles that men and women in uniform not only play but have to play on the battlefield. The imperative of understanding where you are, who you're engaging with, because more often than not, it's not going to be a public diplomacy officer who's engaging with the village leader. It's going to be the colonel or the major or the lieutenant who is on the spot without necessarily the formal training and in that position of engaging. So I just want to start with you, Chris, and ask if you could just talk a little bit about your experience in Afghanistan, your role in as a military man in dealing with the non-military elements, and why it is you decided to connect with Greg Mortensen and what you think that did and brought to your work.
Oh, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here as a part of the conference, as a part of this great panel. You know, when we were growing up in the military, as whether as a lieutenant or captain, and you're going through all the professional development schools and different things that the military offers. There's sort of an underlying assumption, or there had been for many, many years, an underlying assumption that the battlefield is essentially antiseptic in the sense that it is a force-on-force kind of engagement, and the civilian population was not much of a factor as we thought about what it meant to be in conflict. It was very much a conventional war mindset. And there was even a debate in the 1990s about a revolution in military affairs, and it was a lot about technology and a lot about targeting and smart munitions and issues like that. And what I've come to find out over the last 4 years is that the revolution in military affairs is not about technology. To the extent that there's one ongoing, it's really about relationships and the importance of relationships, whether it's civil-military relationships and working with U.S. government partners, relationships with the media, relationships with the population. And that happens not just at commander level, whether it's colonels or lieutenant colonels or captains, but even at the soldier level. And it's something that we've had to learn, and we often haven't learned it really well initially, but over time, I think we've gotten much better in terms of understanding the criticality of relationships in places such as Afghanistan, in places such as Iraq, in terms of being able to be effective in assisting with security as a counterinsurgent, essentially as a diplomat, if you will, or as a representative of the United States and of the American government. In terms of how I got involved with Greg Mortensen, I have my wife with me, who, as so many have done, had read Greg's book, 3 Cups of Tea, as a part of a book club. And she said, hey, I was in Afghanistan at the time. She said, sent the book and said, hey, you might be interested in reading this. So, of course, I read it and couldn't put it down, absolutely loved it, and saw the same kind of issues with education in Afghanistan that Greg writes so powerfully about in Pakistan. And also, his book highlighted, something that we found as well, is that, relationships with local communities, with community leaders, but also ordinary citizens within communities. And community mobilization and ownership is so important to be able to accomplish any goals in rural areas. So as I read it, those two things really hit home to me, and I wrote Greg Mortensen. There's an email address in the back of the book, so I just wrote Greg and said how inspirational I thought his book was. Never expected to hear anything back, and a couple weeks later, Greg sent a note, said he's looking forward to expanding his operations. Asked if we had some places in Afghanistan that would be interested in school. It just so happens we've been working with a number of communities on that issue. And different things, led to different things. Suddenly there were a bunch of schools being built by Greg's organization in Kunar. Later, when I came back to Afghanistan in the summer of 2009 with General McChrystal, reconnecting with Wakil was really important because he would bring elders from different parts of the country to talk to me, to meet with General McChrystal and others. And it enabled us to get just more data points and get outside of this sort of Kabul bubble and connect with people in rural areas from different parts of the country, which form critical parts of General McChrystal's assessment, counterinsurgency strategy, and a host of other issues. So the I guess my theme is that the real revolution in military affairs is about relationships with society, within the U.S. government, and with U.S. society, much more so than technology.
Chris, I'm gonna turn to a couple of our other colleagues in just a second, but I just want to follow up and ask: once you built the school, or as you were building the school, what changes, if any, did you see in terms of your colleagues in the military who were actually building it, and those who in Afghanistan who were on the receiving end of it? Where did each side start, and where did they end up?
Well, in terms of we wind up building a lot of schools, a lot of microhydro plants, a whole host of different local developmental projects that we supported in our little corner of Afghanistan, northern Kunar and eastern Nuristan. What was really important to us is it's not that the Americans or the American soldiers were doing something. It was about the relationship and the connection with the local population, the community leaders, and ultimately it was theirs. One of the things that we found is very interesting, and this gets back to the relationship issue, is there had been a methodology within using some of these local development funds of bringing external or outsiders, people outside the community, come and build a certain project. Under the idea that, well, it would be built to a higher standard because this person has a better business reputation or whatever. What we found is that was really, really problematic from the perspective of the population. They didn't want somebody building something in their area, and they felt it was economically disenfranchising and all sorts of other issues. What they really wanted to do is own this. This was their community. And the Afghans have this great saying, if you sweat for it, you protect it. And the more they felt they owned local development, Afghans, local community solving, local community problems, the more effective the relationship grew, and the more stable the area, the different areas would become. So that was really the critical. It wasn't necessarily about this specific project, or about a specific event. It was about the relationships and how they grew over time and matured and built confidence to the point where we were able to work together for mutual goals.
Thanks, Chris. Barbara, I want to turn to you. You've just come back from a month serving as bureau chief for CNN in Kabul, and you've been to Afghanistan and Iraq a number of times. When you choose the stories that you report, and when you are reporting about conflict on the battlefield, how do you choose the stories, and what kind of importance do you assign to the non-military parts of the story?
Well, I think like any other major news organization, it is somewhat of a committee effort. I think the question is, what's really news these days? Well, you know it when you see it. So inevitably, some of it is news of the day. Inevitably, some of it is features that we might come across that we work on. But my personal interest has been for a long time in trying to sort of illuminate the non-military side of the war, because General Petraeus, General McChrystal, General Odierno in Iraq, I don't know of a single commander that will tell you that Iraq or Afghanistan ever could have been won by bombs and bullets. Some may have come to that realization later than others, but I think it's been many, many years that everyone agrees. So we have this concept of the hearts and minds, but what does that really mean for the U.S. military? I would illustrate it by an example that happened to me, actually not in Iraq or Afghanistan, but a few years ago in southern Ethiopia. We went, just a cameraman and myself, to live for a couple of days with a small group of U.S. Army soldiers in a terribly famine-stricken poor part of southern Ethiopia. They had established a small base there, and they were trying to help this community. As I recall, I don't think it was more than a dozen soldiers. And to get there, I mean, to tell you how rural it was, I just have to share. We went in on a very, very small military plane, but the plane had to make a couple of passes over the dirt strip to chase off the camels before we could come around and land again. So that's how rural it was. These soldiers had established a relationship with this village that would leave you awestruck. I mean, these are soldiers who were not trained in this. They were a National Guard unit from New York. The first thing they did is to try and help with the famine. They got a water pump brought in, and they installed the water pump on the river so that water could be brought up into a field, and they could try and help them learn to irrigate this field. And it's what my military colleague is talking about right now. The Ethiopian village took ownership of that water pump. The military could have put a rifle platoon there. It had to be protected, by the way, not from robbers or criminals or insurgents, but from hyenas and crocodiles. That was the enemy on this river in Ethiopia. So you could put a rifle platoon there, but instead, the village became enabled, and all the men stood guard and stood, to chase off the animals, and the water pump began to function, and there were crops in this village again. One of the days we were there, they held a medical clinic. Hundreds of Ethiopians came walking with their children and their this and their that, but mainly their children, to this U.S. Army medical clinic. And an Ethiopian woman came in carrying an absolutely screaming baby, infant. I don't think I'd ever seen an infant in so much pain. And this woman in her black cloak and her black scarf hands her screaming baby to a U.S. Army soldier. They can't communicate. It's a medical unit. She knows that. There was an interpreter there, but she hands her baby, a farm lady, to an American soldier. And the medical team discovered that the baby had an abscess and it had to be drained and all of this. But I thought about what struck me is, what does it take for a mother in Ethiopia who only knows that military uniforms in her village generally mean trouble. Generally, it means government forces are in southern Ethiopia causing the villagers nothing but trouble in those days. What does it take for a young Ethiopian mother to hand her screaming baby to a man in uniform that she has no idea what may happen next? And that, to me, is the ultimate citizen soldier of the New York National Guard, the ultimate citizen diplomacy. This is something this village, I'm pretty darn sure, is going to remember for a very long time. And they had ownership. I think that's very important.
And let me just take that one step further. I think someplace in this room, if I was not mistaken, I did see one of the members of the Wisconsin National Guard, from whom you're going to hear, I think, in the next day or two, about a spectacular program that I think is going to serve as a template, where members of the Wisconsin National Guard are working with folks in Nicaragua and applying some of the talents that they have learned through their profession, and giving back in this way. Barbara, I guess my question would be this, having heard your story here, and knowing that when there is catastrophe, when you have the earthquake in Haiti, when you have a flood in Pakistan, Americans and the world do see the kinds of things our men and women in uniform are doing on a humanitarian basis. without your CNN hat on, but with your reporter's expertise, do you think we're seeing enough of that coverage at times and in places where it's not an immediate disaster or catastrophe? And if not, why not?
Well, it's just hard to do it without saying that it's a how do I answer that without offering my personal view that it's a subject matter that interests me? So no, I don't think we're seeing enough of it. So I'm being terribly, I suppose, biased here.
We're honest here.
Why aren't we seeing enough of it? In a lot of places, it's access. I went on an agriculture patrol with the National Guard in Afghanistan. We went tramping through Afghan farmers' grape fields. They were trying to teach the Afghan farmers better irrigation methods. It was a fascinating story. But in so many places today, there are these dueling realities on the ground. You are in conflict zones where it's very difficult to get to. It's hard to travel. No matter how much you want to tell a story, even NGOs, security is a fundamental issue. And you have that competing element, which is the world still cringes a little bit at the notion of the militarization of humanitarian assistance. In so many parts of the world, so many governments, the Ethiopian government, very skeptical of letting too much aid, too much assistance, too much of a U.S. military footprint in. We saw it in Myanmar. They wouldn't, they wouldn't let us in. They wouldn't let the U.S. military in. So these are the competing challenges today.
And those are images, I think, that not only affect how people perceive us outside the U.S., but even within the U.S. there are difficulties of perceptions that may not be reality. So I want to turn to you, Caitlin. You and I live in a world which is defined by State Department, Defense Department, either cooperation or non-cooperation. Who has the money, who needs the money, who has the talent, who doesn't. You are working in Afghanistan, and you've been there, what, 18 months now?
14.
14 months.
Yep.
Tell us some of the things that you do in your job where you do interact with the military either because you want to or because you're forced to. And in doing that, tell us what the difference is, and tell us, how your job is either made easier or more difficult with your interaction with the military.
Sure. As the embassy spokesperson, I talk to the military all day. Everything that goes on, we both, I say both sides of the street. The U.S. Embassy is literally connected by a gate and a street to ISAF, which is the military command. So we literally open a door in the gate and we walk through, we go see each other, we walk back. And we talk all day long. Everything that happens, journalists are coming to ISAF, they're coming to me, asking for answers. And we try to do a really good job of each speaking to the appropriate thing. But the truth is that a lot of things require both of us to speak, and so we do try to coordinate what we're saying. The truth is, and I think everybody knows this, and the reason we're having this panel on the military is the military's big. In Kabul, even though we have more civilians than we've ever had, we have 1,100 now. A year and a half ago, we had 320. Even with 1,100 civilians, we're not even close to the military presence. The military is big, it is loud, it is all over the country. And what they do and what they say has an impact on the mission, on the civilian mission, on what Afghans think. And so working together to make sure that we're saying the same things is really important. More important than that, though, I think, more than just saying the same things, although as a spokesperson, I think what we say is very important. Really, how are we working together in the field? Are we sitting together coming up with joint strategies? Are we picking projects that we both agree are the right way forward? Are we both agreeing that we should go to the community and that they need to take this kind of ownership that Chris talked about and that Brian talked about? I'm sorry, Chris and Barbara talked about. Everything we do really has to be done together. As civilians, we can't move around Afghanistan on our own. We have to do it with the military. So how we decide to go about things has to be done together. Again, what we say is really important, but I think actions speak louder than words. It goes to our policy, it goes to the policy of deciding that when we're going to go militarily into a place that we're actually going to stay there. Start to build those relationships on the civilian side, that we're going to come with projects, that we're going to come with quick impact projects, that we're then going to follow those up with real development. It's making those decisions together, talking about them together, working on them together. You know, me as the civilian spokesperson saying something isn't really terribly effective if I don't really have my military colleagues saying, yes, that's what we think is the way forward as well. Without that kind of support, you guys are back here reading the press. I'm kind of depressed reading the newspaper, and even the great things Barbara puts on there. You would think that Afghanistan is a lot of infighting, that the military and civilians and the Afghans aren't agreeing on anything, and you know, I don't think that's really accurate. And I do wish there were more stories that were explaining what's really the good civilian work that's going on, the good military work that's going on. That's not just humanitarian, but that's really building Afghan governance, that's building the Afghan police, that's doing all the things President Obama sort of laid out for us to do. But they tend to get lost in the bombs and the infighting and what President Karzai has said yesterday or today and how we're reacting to it. So I guess what I would say is that we do have these distinctions and we do own issues. There are issues that people refer just to the embassy. That's mine. I own it as the U.S. Embassy, as a civilian effort. But really, there's absolutely nothing we can do on our own. I have to talk to the military every day. If I don't, there's not much of a point of me trying to keep going, because the effort really is international. It's civ and mil together, and it has to be with the Afghans. So we have a lot of meetings where we all sit together, and not me in the military, but us with our Afghan counterparts, increasingly hosted by the Afghans at Afghan institutions, to say, all right, you know, last week we met, the Lisbon summit's coming up. Everyone knows, I think that's the 19th and 20th in Lisbon. It's a really big deal for Afghanistan. The Afghans called a meeting with me and ISAF and the Brits and the Canadians and said, can we all talk about how we talk about this together? I said, that's fantastic. So we can all do our own parts, but frankly, without the military, you know, buying into what we're doing, it's not going to be effective. So I work with the military every single day. The things that happen on a daily basis out in the field, whether it's a civilian casualty or you know, a night raid, that becomes an issue for all of us working on Afghanistan. So we're all following what the military is doing. We're all paying attention, and you know, we just can't do it without working together. So it's a slightly rambling answer, but we're really knitted up out in the field in a way that I think I wouldn't have expected 5 years ago. The amount of togetherness and, you know, integration that we deal with every single day.
Let me take that point one step further and ask you, just to be contrary.
Go ahead.
Are there things that the military is doing, from your point of view, that you wish you were doing as a State Department or as a public diplomacy professional? And the second part of that would be, if you see any kind of imbalance, is it an imbalance of financial resources, or are there other imbalances?
From my perspective, most of the imbalances are simply based on capability and resources. There are things I think the military would be very happy to have the State Department do, but we simply don't have the people, or we don't have the budgets, or we don't have the capability to do them. And so the answer for us then is to work with the military to ensure that what they're doing, in fact, reflects our expertise and our knowledge, so that it comes out in a way that makes us all happy. But yeah, most of the time it's a question of who has what capabilities, and in the end, the military has most of those. You know, I think particularly in Kabul, we're really collaborative. We sit down and look at a problem and say, who has what pots of money can we look at, what people do we have, and who can we put on this? And if they're on the military side of the street, that's fine, as long as we actually staff this properly. So I would answer the question that way. I forgot the question before that.
I think you did great.
Okay.
I'm gonna turn to Brian now. Brian, you've lived on both sides of a world that changed dramatically at the beginning of this century. You were the spokesman at the 6th Fleet at a time when many people thought the world was a little simpler. And you also, at the beginning of our military activity in Iraq in this century, were involved in designing the embed program for journalists. Take the two worlds that you have lived in militarily, and was understanding the cultural environment of equal importance, or has it become more important now?
Well, I feel especially ancient after listening to Chris and Caitlin and Barbara talking about the progress that's been made in terms of our engagement in Afghanistan and to some extent Pakistan, and going back to Iraq a bit. My experience actually goes back to the Iran-Iraq War. I've been doing media operations for the U.S. Since the Iran-Iraq War. I was in Africa in the 90s, in Somalia and Rwanda at the end of the Civil War. And then Sixth Fleet, I was there during the Kosovo War and during the evacuation of Albania. And that experience, as I was listening to the panelists, my experience has been that it was always a very informal value in terms of engagement, our ability to engage successfully with wherever we happen to be. And when I say we, I'm talking about the U.S. military. And it was always in the context of who had been there before us. And oftentimes that was extremely informal. I think about Rwanda, for example, where the NGOs that were there, the Doctors Without Borders, the journalists who had been there through the entire Civil War, and I think about one New York Times reporter who educated me once I hit the ground with the U.S. forces on what was the lay of the land. I had lots of intelligence to read, but I didn't really have a good sense of who should we be looking to where we were operating within Kigali, for example, to where we would be most successful in at least communicating why we were there. And that's been my limited experience throughout the times. In Albania, when we went in to evacuate the Albanians, we just went in as we always do, and there were knowledgeable people there. The embassy there was extraordinary, but our link up with the embassy was very limited. And it has always seemed to be that way. When I was given the opportunity to design whatever public affairs plan we were going to use in Iraq, we just huddled together. I brought a bunch of young military officers together, and since I'd been through most of the contingencies that we've been through over the last 2 decades, we had lots of lessons learned. And obviously access by the media to this extraordinary operation was going to be very important. So we went through the lessons learned, found out how we might be able, and we read into the war plan. So we had information that was useful for us to be able to design a plan that offered what we thought to be optimum access, so the international public, through stories from the press, international press, could get a sense of why we were there and what we were doing. And you know how that played out. And so that was that. And I could talk for a very long time on all of this. This is a wonderful topic, but that's been my experience.
Barbara, I want to turn back to you, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm going to put you on the spot.
Go.
In terms of what you've seen of the coverage of Iraq and Afghanistan, and maybe particularly Afghanistan, and based on the comments that you'd made earlier in terms of some of the non-military issues, the non-military actors, the forces that shape how Afghans or Iraqis view the conflicts in their countries. Are there things, you know, that you have that you have or have not seen in the coverage, whether you've done it or other reporters have done it, having to do with some of these non-military factors that you think would have given American audiences a better sense of the conflict, or do you think we are seeing, you know, through television's eyes, a pretty accurate view as it is?
Well, Doug already knows what my answer is going to be, which is, so, as a reporter, I mean, we've gone through this ebb and flow. The years, and I mean, now we're saying years ago, you know, it seems extraordinary. The years in which Iraq was very, very bad for everyone. For you, Iraq was very, very bad for everyone. For U.S. troops, for coalition troops, for Iraqi civilians, where tens of thousands perhaps lost their lives. I think that one of the, I could call it biggest problem, I just don't even know anymore how to talk about it, was the U.S. government's effort to message the U.S. media and the world media with their view about how the war was going. And I'm not addressing the issue of whether they were true or false. I'm addressing the issue of the U.S. government had then and still has a very strong policy of what their message is. Did the media fall victim to some of that in the early years of Iraq? Absolutely, there's no question. Did the media completely fall victim to it? No. Everything in life is shades of gray. But as the years have gone on now, and as we look at both of these wars, and especially as Afghanistan continues, it's so important for the news media not to be messaged, and if we are, to resist it at all costs. So one of the challenges is when you have these genuinely good news stories, something positive happening, for it to be factually, accurately, and fully reported by government officials for us. But when they're on a day when there's bad news too, Doug knows my biggest beef with public affairs is when there's a bad news story and it's really bad, and you go and you try and ask questions and you get the answer of, we're just not talking about that. I'm like, what do you mean you're not talking about it? Well, we're not going to get into that. Is it classified? No, we're just not going to get into it. It's years and years and years of this messaging being built up. And I think that both the U.S. government and the media has paid a serious and mixed price for all of this, because, and I'll wrap up by saying this, Defense Secretary Robert Gates will tell you, while on the U.S. side we're, in complete constant turmoil over this question, insurgents, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, your garden variety, less than upstanding citizen around the world can out-communicate the U.S. military, as I believe I'm semi-quoting him accurately, when he has referenced that, he's tired of being out-communicated by a guy in a cave. Right? Semi-accurate?
Semi-accurate leading towards accurate, actually.
Right.
Actually,
Bob Gates is getting darned annoyed, and he's very much tried to do something about communication, and I would say that he likes to start his day with what the truth and the facts are, not what the message is. Just needs to filter down in the Pentagon a little more, Doug.
you raised a lot of good questions, but we're not going to be able to get into them at this point, I'm afraid. No, there is one, though, that you raised that I do want to talk about here as we conclude maybe the formal part of this panel, and then we open it up to any points that people would like to discuss. And this gets back to the human resource part of direct communication. In the panel, the plenary that you chaired, Barbara, we talked a lot about social media and instantaneous communication, which can either help or hinder what is key in communication, which is the personal direct interaction that often can make the difference between people understanding values, understanding facts, understanding policy, or not. And getting back to the point, I guess, that I'd raised with Caitlin, I want to raise this with all of you too, and maybe starting with Chris. A lot of people would say that the military has been put in a position over the last 10 to 15 years of having its successor generation leaders because they have no alternative to learn the precise skills of interacting in foreign cultures that those who have been charged for so many years of dealing with them in our non-military government entities are losing or have lost because of a lack of independence, an inability to move freely in conflict societies, and career paths that aren't necessarily providing the kinds of incentives that NGOs offer young people who feel that if they want to go to Yemen or Pakistan or Somalia, wherever, that they have a better opportunity to make a difference. What are your views on that? I'm going to ask all of the folks on the panel, what are your views on that in terms of the human resources with regards to direct engagement? On the military side, on the non-military side, is there an imbalance? If there is, what's your view about addressing it?
Well, with respect to the the engagements and the balance, I spent 15 months in Kunar and Nuristan in 2007, 2008, and we did not have a single Department of State, Treasury, aid, civilian that worked with us, as a part of our task force. Even within the provincial reconstruction teams in those different provinces, you maybe had one state person or one aid person. Rarely would you have both, and if you happen to have both, it was just for a very short period of time while one was rotating out and the other coming back in. In terms of what the administration has done since 2009, has been absolutely extraordinary in terms of the number of civilians who are in Afghanistan now. I think as Caitlin indicated, it's more than tripled.
It's more than tripled, and in the field, the period that you were talking about, just after that, we had 44 civilians in the field. We now have 360. There's an eight-time increase there, just out in the field outside of Kabul. But it's been extraordinary, and what we understand is this is checking facts still, but the largest and fastest civilian plus-up since the Vietnam War. It's been immense. So there are more civilians than there ever have been out in the field working side by side with the military.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and it's really extraordinary what's happened over the past 18 months. And if we believe that this kind of conflict is something that the U.S. government is going to continue to stay engaged in different parts of the world, then we do have to take a look at human resources and how we develop our people across the U.S. government to ensure that we've got the capabilities, the whole of government capabilities, to be able to do the things that we've learned in Iraq and Afghanistan are necessary for stabilizing local conflict areas.
Brian, you get a shot at this.
Well, I think it's played out very clearly that there is an imbalance of resources, and that it has a lot to do with how our government approaches engagements overseas. And I'm talking specifically war and contingencies, that security is a dominant source of investment, and it's kind of a traditional look at security. We put a lot of money, a lot of resources in that, but we soon realize as we're engaged and wherever we're engaged that the knowing where we are and who we're engaged with can be just as equally as important as taking out whoever the bad guys might be. And I think a good example of that right now is Afghanistan. It's been played out very clearly that there is an acute difference of an opinion right now on what will be the most effective approach towards a successful end in Afghanistan. And you have people that are quite learned on both sides of the aisle saying that on one hand, if we remove enough of a certain layer of the Taliban, then that will create a security situation that will help us have a successful end. And then there are others just as learned that say this will actually just create an increasingly larger element that will cause it to be destabilizing. So to me, the investment that's made on the non-kinetic side, on the State Department side, on the knowledgeable piece about where we're engaged can pay huge dividends, and Chris played that out very nicely in what he said, as did Caitlin, as did Barbara.
Well, Barbara's going to get another shot here at that point about human resources, and then Caitlin, you get the last word.
I don't know that I have much to add. I agree with what everyone says, and I'm coming back again and again to what Chris said. It only works, especially in a place like Afghanistan, if a local village feels they own their security. When on this trip I just came back from, some soldiers, I was out way in the east, we were standing on a hill and they were pointing to the villages where they were responsible for the security. And they were saying, I said to them, so are these villages hostile to you? They said, no, not particularly. They really don't want us there. They don't want the Taliban there. And they don't even want their own government there. They're, in a place like Afghanistan, they're very fierce, proud, independent, tribal people. And they want to look after themselves. And that's a challenge.
Caitlin, you get the last.
Just very quickly, I think, you know, our department's leadership, Secretary Gates and Secretary Clinton, have both spoken to the fact that the State Department does need more resources, that our diplomats do need more resources, and I think that's absolutely true, but I don't think it should take away in any way from the fact that our military folks, who really are the first to engage an Afghan elder, have that knowledge that they need about Afghan history, about the language and local customs. And so I think it's something we both need, that investment's needed on both sides. But yeah, definitely, I think, you know, selfishly as a State Department diplomat, I would tell you, I think we need more resources. But those things, just understanding the history and what's gone on in that village before you were there, is massively important, and I think it's something that needs to be passed on. The Defense Department's doing really great things with your AFPAC Hands program and really trying to give people that knowledge, but you can't overstate the importance of understanding that initial interaction when you're the first into a village, when you're the first into a home, when you're the first into a school, what statement you're making, and I think that's really important that everybody have that cultural understanding.
That is a perfect way to end the formal part, and I'm going to just offer my 2 cents worth before we open this up and say that I've worked on the non-military side with the State Department, with the USIA, and at the Pentagon. And I have worked in NGOs, from Sister Cities International to the Howard Gilman Foundation. And my conclusion is that it ultimately is the credibility and the trust that is established not only by the content of what you're conveying, but by who is conveying it. You cannot try to be credible with a message if it's not believable by the person who is listening or hearing it. It's one of the reasons that we spend so much time, officially and unofficially, with those who are involved in citizen diplomacy in conflict societies. Because citizen diplomats, citizens who engage through NGOs, really start out with a kind of credibility that all of us would like to have. They're there of their own free will. They're there trying to accomplish something. They're trying to, and they're communicating with people because they want people to listen, learn, and hear what they're saying through their own eyes. It's a matter of establishing a process through each other's eyes. So I would just conclude this by saying that those, like all of you in the room, who are involved in the kinds of people-to-people programs, whether it's in conflict societies or not, you bring a credibility to your engagement that is of great importance to this country and to our national interest and to our national security, and that those in government can learn an awful lot by where, how, and the ways you engage. So with that, I'm going to bring this formal part to a close, ask you to join me in thanking my colleagues for wonderful presentations. And because I'm sitting down, I can't see beyond the second row. I'm going to stand up and just open this up and ask if people would like to make some points. Yes, over there. Yes, ma'am.
What are the main dangers faced by girls and women who are going to school in Afghanistan? And is there any protection offered by the military for these girls and women?
You mean Afghan girls and women?
Yes. Or, you know, just because you're going to schools.
I'll let Caitlin and Chris.
Sure, I'll let you handle the second part. Well, I think there are a lot of issues on education for women and girls. First, I mean, are there schools and are there teachers wherever these girls and women live available for them? If there are, can they get there? How far away are there? Are there roads? Do they have a way to get there that's safe? You know, Afghan girls in general can't just walk around by themselves. Particularly in cities, you can see girls holding hands and going to school together. If you've got a couple girls, that's great. But for the most part, it's very difficult to walk on your own for 4 miles or 5 miles to school. It's a real security issue, particularly in those areas that are unsafe. So whether or not parents will let their kids make that journey on their own is another question. The Taliban, as you know, have been very vocal since their existence about not wanting women to have the same rights. And you've seen schoolgirls attacked on the way to school. And so I think every parent in Afghanistan thinks through whether it's going to be safe to send their daughter to school. So the real issues, I think, are resources and security. I don't know if you agree with that or if you have another perspective.
Yeah, I was really amazed, and I'm going to, from the perspective of Kunar and Nuristan, and I'll contrast that with Kabul and other big cities. I was really amazed in Kunar and Nuristan as I interacted with elders from a whole host of different villages, different ethnicities and tribal groups, whether Pashtuns or Nuristanis or Kohistanis or Gujars. They all wanted girls' schools for their communities, and the more they talked about education, the more they were focused on, I want to be able to send my daughters to school. In terms of security in the rural areas for local schools, it really wasn't an issue in that part of the country because the community protected the kids who were going to school. As you get into some bigger cities in Kabul or Jalalabad or Mazar-i-Sharif, et cetera, it can be a different issue. Again, as people go to local community schools, generally it's under the protection, if you will, of that community. As people get into high schools and travel becomes more, becomes a requirement to get to those places, then the security can be more problematic, depending on which area of Afghanistan you're discussing. And so part of our job is to work together with community leaders, with Afghan National Security Forces, to provide an environment where people have the freedom to be able to go carry about the business of ordinary everyday life, whether that's going to school, whether that's going to work, or going to market.
Barbara or Brian, anything?
Well, I just want to say that, I don't disagree with what anybody said here, except the issue to me at least, the issue of Afghan women, girls' rights is still very often seen through our Western eyes. There may be, there is a tremendous amount of progress. We who've lived there or have visited as reporters, you do see girls go to school, especially in Kabul. You see more children going to school. But I think the issue of women and children needs to be looked at very, very carefully, because I don't know of any rural village you will ever go to in Afghanistan these days where you will see women and children freely moving on the street. Women may be freed of the burqa by the Taliban, but women more and more are covered because of not just the cultural sensitivities that exist in Afghanistan, but because they are compelled to by their village or their male relatives. Having been there just a couple of weeks ago, I was genuinely surprised as many times as I'd been there to see that in Kabul, every woman everywhere even if it's just a scarf, covers her hair now. And the question for women and children really in Afghanistan, I think, women let's say, is what amount of free choice and free will they have. I think it's very dangerous for us to look at this through our Western eyes and conclude something. We really have to see it through their eyes and see what restrictions they still live under, no matter what democratically elected government sits in the presidential palace.
I think you've raised a really interesting and critical point, because I want to add a different perspective to that. I think the whole issue of women and place of women, the rights of women in Afghan society is one on which there is no unanimity in Afghan society. There are certainly cultural history and norms which speak to the point that you make. But it was very interesting for me when I went to Kabul. I have a close friend there who's now the Minister of Information and Cultures, the former Afghan ambassador to India. He is a writer, a historian, and I spend a lot of time talking with him by email or when I was there in person about what he thought about the U.S. presence, the NATO presence in Afghanistan. He didn't say an awful lot at the beginning of our conversation, but at the end of the lunch, he went to his office and he brought for me what was his farewell present. It was a portrait, which clearly had been hidden away for years because he had to wipe the dust off it, of a woman sitting on books. He said that the portrait was a self-portrait painted by a woman during the time of the Taliban, and that had this portrait been discovered, she would have been killed. But that was his statement about why it was important that we be there. So I think that I think this issue is one that is, as Barbara has said, has huge cultural ramifications, and I don't believe there is a unanimity at this point in my view. Yes, Sherry?
Yeah, Sherry Mueller with NCIV. In some ways, two quick questions, Doug, and thank you for just a very stimulating set of ideas. In some ways, you could think of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq as the most expensive study abroad program we've ever mounted. And Chris, you talked about what we're learning, the fact that relationships are important. Could you dig a little deeper? What is the military learning, and with so much rotation, how do you translate the lessons you've learned to the people who come after you? And then secondly, is there a role for organizations like NCIV or other citizen diplomacy organizations to host IMAT trainees, people we're training, our military is training in our country, to make them feel more at home, to get them into American homes beyond the military? So one question about overseas and what we're learning, another is what can we do here with foreign military who come for training?
Chris, feel free to start and we'll ask everyone.
Sure. In terms of what does the military learn, I want to paint the military with a broad brush, because this is so so individualized in many ways. Are you looking for in terms of an example of?
Yeah, and then how when you leave, you share what
Sure.
you learned with the person. It worries me. We rotate so fast. And
Yeah,
relationships
absolutely.
are so important. How are we maintaining them after we invest so much in starting them?
Mm-hmm. In terms of in terms of an example or set of examples, there was we were getting and the importance of building relationships. One particular village, we had been getting these rocket attacks ever since we arrived. And, we'd been on the ground there for maybe about 2 months in Kunar, and we sat down with their Afghan counterparts and just kind of huddled and said, the rocket attacks are really getting old. Let's develop some way to let's figure out what we do about it. And of course, one response would have been the military solution, if you will, go in and conduct a military operation and find out who's shooting the rockets and try to detain them or whatever. But my Afghan counterpart, battalion commander, said, I think the best thing to do would be to go pay a visit to the village and just find out what's going on and what they're upset about. Because these rocket attacks have been happening for like the last 18 months. And now we were the recipients of these things. And so he did. And he went out there. We conducted an operation with us and Afghan National Army, but they were kind of the people who met with the elders initially. And he came back and after the meeting and he said, we had a really great meeting, and what they're really upset about is about 2 years ago there was a raid in a village, and all sorts of rotten things happened. Houses were broken into, women's jewelry was allegedly stolen, and they were just really, really upset. But they also are really interested in school. And so we took that and said, we have understand what the problem is, or what they say the problem is, but we've also got a potential connection in terms of school and in terms of education. So a week later, had another patrol with like 3 truckloads of school supplies. The next day, the elders arrived at the outpost, completely unannounced, with 100 thank you notes written in Pashto by the children on this, the pens and paper that we had given them, and they said, we want to build a relationship. We want to be able to work together. And we'd really like our kids to get educated. And it became this bridge. So an example of relationships and the importance of it. Now, in terms of the second part of your question, how do you transfer that knowledge? That's really, really difficult. And I think one of the things that's incumbent upon us institutionally is to help people build the appropriate mental models for how to engage in a variety of different cultures, and how to build these kind of relationships. Because there's 2 kinds of knowledge when you try to do this. Training and building intellectual capital, and those things I think are critically important. We have a long ways to go in that sense, so we can more effectively convey the explicit knowledge and not lose a lot in a turnover.
Can I maybe answer a little bit? I can't speak for the military, so stop me if I'm saying something you disagree with. But I think I've done Afghanistan. Before I got to Afghanistan and lived there, I worked on it from Washington for about 5 years. So I've been, in and around Afghanistan for a long time. And I think as a government, what we've learned, Iraq and Afghanistan, is really that we have to listen. As Americans, we can look at a problem and say, okay, I can see the solution. This is exactly what we're going to need. Here's how we're going to do it, and go do it. That doesn't work in Afghanistan. And I think what has seeped into our thinking and our understanding and our policy making over the past few years is that our solutions don't work. They may work, some of them may work, but what really works is listening to the Afghans and saying, why is this happening? What is your grievance? What is not working for you? What is it that you need? What is it that you want from us? And then trying to achieve our objectives through solutions that meet their needs. Afghan solutions tend to be the best solutions. They often require us to step back and not do what we want to do, not do what we think is the best solution, but all of us, military and civilians, getting that into our mindset that it's going to take, those 3 cups of tea to stop and listen and say, okay, what is the crux of this problem? And then tackling it, sometimes slowly, sometimes in a way that isn't really the way we want to go, but that's a sustainable solution in the end. It would be a terrible thing if we imposed, answers that we thought worked and left Afghanistan. I think we would be, my personal opinion, not the State Department view, my personal opinion is we would be back. But if we do this right, if we do it in a way that addresses Afghans' real needs, that helps them build a government that they think they can believe in, then we're going to achieve our policy objectives, our American policy objectives. And I think military, civilian, on all sides. That's something that we've really learned out of being in Afghanistan.
Yeah, we have to be much more effective at listening. And Barbara, you said, I don't want to be messaged. And Afghans and so many people throughout the world are the exact same way. We often, I had some British colleagues and they were saying, talking about how they wanted to get their messages across and wanted to do a bunch of, sort of different talking points. And this is how they were going to, let people know that they're, there to help. And I remember saying, instead of going in with talking points, go in with listening points. Have things that you want to learn about as a result of this experience. And I think we in the U.S. government have to do a better job, military, civilian alike, of listening first.
We have time for a couple more questions. Let me just do this. There's been a lot of questions over here, and I know I just want, because I can't see. Am I missing someone over here? Yes, sir.
Correspondent from the International Center of Worcester, Massachusetts. I've been really encouraged by the increase of emphasis in the military and in the Homeland Security communities on citizen diplomacy over the last few years. I'm wondering if all of the programs that are funded under the Defense Department are actually implemented by military personnel, or to focus in on Sherry's second question a little bit, are there or do you foresee any programs funded by the Department of Defense which would engage and utilize the network of citizen diplomats who are in this conference?
As long as you don't call them contractors, there's a shot here. Anybody want to respond?
I don't have an expertise to respond to that question directly, but on a larger point, and this gets back to something that Caitlin said earlier, and also Barbara and Brian. One of the things that we have to continue to explore is how do we make the whole of the efforts greater than the sum of their parts? How do we leverage the comparative advantage of whether it's elements of the U.S. government, non-governmental organizations, international governmental organizations, et cetera? How do you work together? Coordinate without being co-opted, if you will, when we talk about non-governmental organizations. How do we do that in a way that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and the best possible outcome is achieved for the people that we are serving, whether it's in a rural area of Ethiopia or Afghanistan or Iraq, and certainly within the national interest. I think a lot more has to be done in that regard in terms of continuing to explore that issue of comparative advantage and how the whole of the efforts are greater than each individual action.
If it's okay, I just want to add my own thought to what you had to say with regards to the Defense Department funding of programs like this. It's clear that in many cases, defense money in exchange programs is the kiss of death. You lose the credibility from the target audience because they wonder how are they being used, or what kind of propaganda is there because of perceptions that exist about military money. By the same token, you do have a growing cadre of younger leaders in the military, people like Chris and many others, who are coming back from these places and who have their own thoughts and ideas about the kinds of non-military programs that ought to be developed. In the last panel, I talked a bit about the U.S.-Pakistan exchange program that we are in the process of trying to foster. I think Akif Ahmad is here, and Scott Beal of Atlas Corps, who's getting one of the awards here. Both of them are intimately involved in that. We can play a catalyst role. I do think it's a very fair thing to say that there needs to be a pot of money, or pots of money, whether those are joint defense State Department pots or wherever they would come from, which can be tapped and utilized more nimbly, with less bureaucracy and less waiting time than is currently the case. I haven't seen any great solutions to the problem, but it's a problem crying out for creative solution. Yes, sir.
What about the civilian response corps? Is there any way that that could be integrated into this, into the program?
We have actually quite a lot of folks from the Civilian Response Corps and what's called SCRS, the coordinator for civilian response at the State Department. We actually have a lot of those folks at the in Kabul and all over Afghanistan right now, filling critical gaps and doing things that the State Department generally is not set up well to do, like assessment and analysis. We have a whole team in Kabul right now that is putting together with the military our what we call integrated civ-mil action plan. These are folks who are really good at a particular kind of skill that most of us aren't trained in. And so there are a lot in Kabul already, and I think we're happy to have more when we have real needs for them. So they're doing their part. They're cycling through Afghanistan. I've been there over a year, and I've been with several different groups of folks from the Civilian Response Corps. They're doing important work.
Final question, the gentleman right behind.
I'm on the board of an NGO that has occasion to work in conflict zones. If you are advising people that have responsibility for the safety and security of NGO personnel, be they local personnel or non-local personnel, are there things beyond the usual security plan, evacuation training, and so on? Is there creative thinking, either in terms of the military, whether it be mission or in terms of engagement, how is it different in a place like Yemen versus a place like Afghanistan and Iraq where we have a military presence? And is there creative thinking from the NGO perspective of how you work beyond, staying below the radar, how you might engage more effectively to ensure security in difficult zones without militarizing the NGO mission and without actually making it even more dangerous?
Anybody? Brian?
Well, again, my experience is, I wouldn't say limited, but in this particular area where we actually, when I was at Brookings, we were trying to foster just that kind of discussion about 3 years ago. And correct me if I'm wrong, because I've got 2 more recent looks at it, but that's an interagency effort that has not, that is rich for mining, from my perspective. And we don't have that kind of creative approach right now from everything that I've seen.
Well, I wouldn't dissent, but I would say one of the things that we are doing a lot at the embassy in Afghanistan is doing more and more of our work through NGO partners, through implementing partners, understanding that we as the U.S. government are going to bring unnecessary attention, even Western attention, to projects that don't need it and are therefore endangered by it. Some of the most successful groups working in Afghanistan are those that hire a great majority of their staff locally. Afghans are able to move around Afghanistan far more easily than a Dutch person or me or you. And I think to the extent that you can look to, again, local solutions, to where are those places where you have a real cadre of local experts that you can rely on, I think makes it that much easier for you to operate anywhere that you have security problems. And I've worked in Iraq and Afghanistan, but it's certainly the case in Afghanistan that the more local expertise you can bring, the better off you are, the lower profile you can take. I know the same is true for my staff who work at the embassy. My Afghan staff can drive around in their cars and it's fine. They look like everyone else. It's a bit more difficult for me to get around town. But that's to the extent I could encourage you to look at what the expertise is you can get locally. It just seems obvious, but I don't know if you have any other advice.
NGOs in conflict zones are my heroes. Absolutely. I mean, they don't have all the protection that we do, and yet they're out there in these extraordinarily difficult areas, doing tremendous work. I think there are ways that we can work together, coordinate without being co-opted, if you will. That I think should continue to be explored. Certainly the risk of whether it's a militarization of aid or an NGO being sort of super identified with U.S. military forces is problematic, and certainly, you know, as a former commander out there, I absolutely respect that. You know, but with a lot of the NGOs that we would work with, they would just let us know, hey, we're going to be in this area, in this, you know, about this time. What are you seeing there? Well, there's a really big problem on the road. I don't recommend you go today, but if you go tomorrow, you know, we're going to be in a different area. But the effects of, you know, our sort of security umbrella will, you know, probably enable you to move more securely to the place that you're going. So it's not that we are providing direct protection to an NGO, but we're able to do some coordination in ways that enable us to do, you know, continue to do the things that we're doing, but also enables the NGO to do the things that they want to do. And the whole of that effort is, you know, provides greater service and greater support to the local population, which is, you know, something that we all have in common.
In bringing this to a close, and David, I think you're back there, and I don't know if I turn this back over to you, and in thanking all of you, I do want to just say one final thing that probably doesn't have anything to do with our presence in Afghanistan or Iraq or elsewhere, and that is this. 1% of America is serving its country in uniform, men and women in uniform, and 99% of us are not. But we're really all in this together, and we are all part of communities around the country. And so those of you who come here from around the United States and represent the people-to-people organizations in your cities and towns, I encourage you to reach out to military families in your communities, to bring in the spouses who have their spouse deployed, and the kids who have their mothers and fathers deployed, because the kinds of activities that you run and that you organize, I think you'll find that there are men and women in uniform and their families who would love to be part of this, and I think they bring an experience and an expertise that could be as beneficial to you as your reaching out to them will be to them. With that, I thank you very much for coming, and wish you a good rest of the conference.